February 25th, 1998, Radio City Music Hall, New York City. The 40th annual Grammy Awards is running on live television, and somewhere behind the curtain, a stage manager is holding a phone against his ear with a hand that will not stop shaking. In less than 20 minutes, the broadcast is supposed to close with the most anticipated performance of the night. Luciano Pavarotti, the greatest tenor of his generation, singing Nessun Dorma in front of tens of millions of viewers. Pavarotti will not be singing tonight. He is canceled suddenly, backstage, citing illness. And somewhere in a dressing room down the same hallway, a woman in a beaded evening gown is being told in a rush of half finished sentences that the aria now needs a voice, hers. She does not ask for the sheet music. She does not ask for a rehearsal. She asks how much time she has. 20 minutes, they tell her. Around her, the hallway is a blur of motion. A production assistant pressing a headset to one ear and shouting numbers into it, a wardrobe person adjusting the strap of her gown without quite making eye contact, a conductor being pulled aside for a hurried, whispered conversation about keys and cues. Somewhere close by, a television monitor bolted to the wall shows the live broadcast still running. An audience of tens of millions, completely unaware that the piece they were promised is no longer coming, that the person about to walk into its place has never sung it in public in her life. She sits for a moment in front of a mirror ringed with bare bulbs, and by every account from people backstage that night, her face does not show panic. It shows the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic no one else in the hallway can see, measuring the distance between what she has just been asked to do and what she actually knows she can do, and finding somewhere in that gap enough room to stand on. She nods once, the way she has nodded at impossible requests for most of her life, and begins walking toward the stage. Stop. To understand how a soul singer from Detroit could walk out and sing Italian opera with no rehearsal and somehow make the room believe she had trained for it her entire life, you have to understand that she, in a sense, had. Aretha Louise Franklin was born on March 25th, 1942, and raised in Detroit in the home of her father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, one of the most celebrated black preachers in America. His house on LaSalle Boulevard functioned as something between a salon and a sanctuary, where gospel legends like Mahalia Jackson, Sam Cooke, and Clara Ward moved freely through the rooms, and where a shy, watchful little girl absorbed every phrase, every ornament, every held note as though it were being poured directly into her. She did not simply hear music in that house, she was steeped in it, the way tea leaves steep in hot water until the water itself has changed. What is less often discussed is how wide that musical education actually was. Aretha's household was not limited to gospel. She grew up with access to classical recordings, jazz records, and an appreciation instilled early for vocal technique across genres. Trained, in her own words in later interviews, to listen for the architecture underneath a performance, not just the emotion on top of it. She took piano lessons. She studied the mechanics of breath and phrasing the way a musician studies an instrument, even as her natural gift made much of that study feel almost redundant. Visitors to the Franklin home would later recall a particular habit of hers as a child. She would disappear into a back room during gatherings, not to escape the music, but to be closer to it, sitting near the piano while adults rehearsed, watching hand positions, listening for the exact instant a singer chose to hold a note instead of releasing it. Nobody had to teach her that a pause could be as powerful as a note. She simply noticed it, the way some children notice the exact shape of a shadow, long before anyone explains what a shadow is. By 14, she was recording gospel albums as a featured soloist. By 18, she had already given birth to two sons, carrying responsibilities far beyond her years, while her family closed ranks to protect her ability to keep singing. The industry that received her in 1960 when she signed with Columbia Records wanted to turn her into a conventional pop vocalist. It took her 7 years and a move to Atlantic Records in 1967 to find producers willing to simply get out of her way. That year in Muscle Shoals and then in New York, she rebuilt Otis Redding's Respect into an anthem that no longer asked for consideration. It demanded it, spelled out letter by letter, and became one of the defining songs of the civil rights era. Weeks after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in April of 1968, she stood in an Atlanta church and sang Precious Lord, Take My Hand at his funeral. her voice carrying a grief too large for the room to hold on its own. By any measure, she had already proven 100 times over that she could sing anything asked of her. But there is a difference between singing brilliantly within a genre everyone expects you to master and being handed, with 20 minutes' notice, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the entire classical repertoire. A piece written for a trained operatic tenor, not a soul singer, not a woman who had spent her career being boxed, however affectionately, into a single corner of American music. Stop, again, because to understand why Aretha Franklin said yes that night instead of politely declining, you need to understand something about the way she approached the word impossible throughout her career. She rarely respected the boundaries other people tried to draw around her. In 1972, at the absolute commercial peak of her career, she walked into New Bethel Baptist Church, not a concert hall, to record a live gospel album with the Southern California Community Choir. Amazing Grace became the best selling live gospel record of all time. Proof that an artist at the top of the pop charts could return, unguarded and sweating under hot lights, to the exact sound of her childhood and lose none of her audience for doing it. In 1980, when the industry had quietly begun treating her career as a thing of the past, she signed with Arista Records under producer Clive Davis and rebuilt herself entirely for a new decade, delivering hits like Jump to It and Freeway of Love well into her 40s, an age at which the music industry has rarely been kind to women. Footage from those two nights at New Bethel in January 1972 shows her sweating openly under the lights, her makeup unguarded by the second hour, singing with a physical abandon she rarely allowed herself in a secular concert hall. Proof that the sound she had grown up inside of had never actually left her, no matter how many pop charts she topped in the years surrounding it. She had spent 3 decades proving again and again that genre was a suggestion and not a wall. So when a producer backstage at Radio City Music Hall told her that opera's greatest living tenor could not go on, and that the show needed someone, anyone, to fill 4 minutes of live network television with something extraordinary, Aretha Franklin did not think of herself as an outsider being asked to imitate a tradition she did not belong to. She thought of herself as a singer being asked to sing. There was, in fact, a strange and fortunate detail buried in the timing. Earlier that same evening, rehearsal tapes and orchestral arrangements for Nessun Dorma had already been run through the sound system for Pavarotti's own preparation. Aretha had heard fragments of it drifting backstage. She had, by pure accident of proximity, already begun absorbing the shape of the piece hours before anyone asked her to sing it herself. The same instinctive, sponge-like listening she had done as a child in her father's house decades earlier, without knowing it would matter again. Backstage in the final minutes, there was no time for vanity and no time for fear. She adjusted the key slightly to sit inside her own vocal range rather than a tenor's, a practical decision made by an artist who had spent her whole life shaping songs to fit her voice instead of shaping her voice to fit the songs. The orchestra was told. The conductor nodded. Someone handed her a microphone. She walked onto the stage of Radio City Music Hall in a gold gown, the house lights catching the beating as she moved, and there was, for one visible moment, the flicker of an audience realizing that the person walking towards center stage was not the man they had been promised. Then the orchestra began, and she opened her mouth, and any doubt in that room evaporated somewhere in the first 8 bars. But the real story was not what happened in the first 8 bars. It was what happened in her stillness before them. Musicians who watched from the wings that night described a strange, suspended quiet in the seconds before she sang, the kind of silence that exists only in rooms where several thousand people have simultaneously stopped breathing without agreeing to do it. The conductor's baton lifted, the string section drew their bows back, and Aretha Franklin, in a gold gown under lights built for an opera singer half her size, closed her eyes the way she had closed them as a child in her father's choir, and waited for the exact half second where the silence itself seemed to ask her to begin. What followed has been described by musicians and critics who study vocal performance for a living as one of the most astonishing rescues in the history of live television. She did not attempt to imitate an operatic tenor. She sang Nessun Dorma as herself, as a gospel trained soul singer reaching for the same soaring, unresolved hope at the center of the aria, built not on classical training, but on the exact instincts she had built in a Detroit church decades earlier, where a congregation's collective yearning had to be carried, note by note, towards something that felt like release. The climactic high note, the one that had made professional opera singers hold their breath for a century, arrived and held, and the room rose to its feet before the orchestra had even finished. Luciano Pavarotti, watching from wherever he was recovering that night, would later praise the performance publicly, calling it something close to miraculous, and the two would go on to perform together in the years that followed. An unlikely friendship built on a night when one of them could not sing and the other refused to let the moment go unanswered. For an artist who had already redefined an Otis Redding song, resurrected her career twice, and turned a live gospel recording into a cultural landmark, the Grammy night of 1998 became something slightly different. Proof delivered in front of the largest audience of her life that the boundaries other people had spent decades drawing around what a soul singer from Detroit was allowed to attempt had never actually applied to.